"One thing I didn't tell you," Mr. Mercer said next morning, after a quieter night, though sleepless mostly, open-eyed and thinking. "Oh," said Mrs. Mercer, "you made an appointment at the doctor's, I hope?" "Yes," he said, "this afternoon. I was thinking in the night one thing I never told you, never told anyone, come to that. Not a living soul. Nobody ever knew. I'm the only one in the world who knows it even now. Only one alive, I mean." "Well," Mrs. Mercer said. "She was going to have a baby. My Katya was." More and more slowly Mrs. Mercer went on with her toast and homemade damson jam. He sat, turning over his empty hands. His face, she knew, had she confronted it, was looking at her with its puzzled and pleading look, the eyes behind the glasses rather washed out. "I suppose I thought it might upset you at the time." "I see," she said after a while, when her mouth had given up trying to eat. "I suppose you would think that." Then she took her own things to the draining board and left him sitting there with his. They parted company, ate together, slept together, but were in separate circles. Almost at once, as though it were beyond his failing strength, he gave up pitying his wife and fell back down the decades into the couple of months of a summer in the Alps. Between thinking and muttering he went to and fro, up and down, never knew which he was in, and in her company, face to face over another meal, or side by side on a walk to the post office, addressed her or himself. "I wonder where you put that big medical dictionary. It wasn't with the castles behind the jars. In the loft, perhaps." The ladder to the loft was permanently down, encumbering the way into the little living room. A breath of cold hung over the opening, or the warmth of their living space, being drawn up there, was converted into cold just above their heads. He was often up there, rooting around. In the mechanism of her love and duty, she called him down when his meal was on the table. But also at nights he went up there, and she heard him moving and muttering over the bedroom ceiling. Then she wept to herself for the unfairness. Surely to God it wasn't much to ask, that you get through to the end, and looking back don't fill with horror and disappointment and hopeless wishful thinking. All she wanted was to be able to say it hasn't been nothing, it hasn't been a waste of time, the 50 years, that they amount to something, if not a child, a something made and grown between man and wife you could be proud of, and nearly as substantial as a child. And now all this, him burrowing back through the layers, him rooting through all their accumulations to get back where he wanted to be in the time before she was. Once, with a bitterness that twisted her mouth as if the question were vinegar, she asked, "How far gone was she?" 6 weeks, Mr. Mercer answered. "We worked it out, it would be about 6 weeks. The fetus at 6 weeks is a tiny thing, hung in the mother like a creature in hibernation. The medical dictionary was in the loft, in a very cramped place where the eaves came down behind a sort of false wall made of hardboard. But Mr. Mercer found it finally, and in it a picture of the fetus at 6 weeks, and sat there under the bare bulb like an adolescent, staring at it. What struck him most when he thought about him and Katya was their heedlessness. That was the word that came to him. We were heedless. Because really, if it was bad where we were leaving, which was Bavaria, it was not much better where we were heading, which was Italy. And up there in the snow, the minute we set off, what did we do but go and get a baby? Heedless. For obviously we should have to come down again sooner or later, out of the sharp air, the flowers and the snow, and face up to our responsibilities in a bad world getting worse. But then again, when he thought about it, it didn't seem heedless at all, because the thing he was most sure about after all the years was how sure they were all those years ago that what he wanted with her and she was with him was to have a baby and go on living and living together for evermore. And you can't be called heedless when you know as well as that what your purpose is in life and you act accordingly. And though they weren't walking anywhere in particular, only to Italy, and where in Italy it didn't much matter, every day seemed to have enough point to it, getting from wherever they were to wherever they ended up, and finding somewhere nice to stay, as Mr. and Mrs. with her brassy wedding ring. And days when they didn't go anywhere but stayed in bed and took a little stroll in the vicinity when they felt like it seemed just as purposeful as days when they set off at 4 a.m, deadly serious. What did we do for food, I wonder? He asked himself up there in the roof space, as though somebody else was asking him. What did we have for money between us to go on like that, day after day, week after week? I can only suppose, he said to himself aloud or in his head, that God provided and kind people along the way. I have the feeling, he said, that somehow people liked us and somehow or other it gladdened them when we turned up. When Mr. Mercer thought of himself and her, he thought of certain flowers, and not the gentians that were beyond having any ideas about, but a bare and rather frail violet flower that came up actually in the ice. As soon as there was the least gap of grass or earth and the water unfreezing around it and running fast, there you would see one or more of these frail flowers sprung up. Then, and more so now, he wanted to call them, these flowers, brave. But a flower was a flower, and neither brave nor cowardly nor anything else, yet the word brave came to mind when he thought of that quick seizing of a chance to spring up the minute the ice opened, even only a little. And that was how he thought of Katya and himself, after all that time, with Hitler where they'd come from, and Mussolini where they were going to, up there, wandering around and making a baby the minute they turned their backs on civilization. Tuesday again. "Where's the trip today then?" Mr. Mercer asked. It seemed to Mrs. Mercer he had aged 10 years in a week, if that were possible, for a man his age already. "The Horseshoe Pass," she said brightly, "and the Swallow Falls, to see some scenery." "You will enjoy that," he said. The minute the door closed after her, he put his boots on, that were not the boots, but like them, because he had always bought the same, and packed a rucksack with the maps and some provisions for the journey. The maps were the very ones, in Gothic script, with a pair of hikers on the cover in the costume of that time and place. He had found them in the loft with the photographs that he had against his heart now, in a wallet with the letter to prove he had a right to see her in the ice if anyone in authority challenged him. When he was ready with a hat and stick and money from the place he hid his in under one of the joists, he wrote a message to leave on the table for Mrs. Mercer when she came home from her trip. "Dear Kate," he wrote, "I am sorry about the tea again, but trust you will understand that I have to go and see her as the next of kin, and I'm sure it will all be back to normal here with you and me after that. P.S. I've made another appointment for a week on Monday. I think I'll ask him for something a bit stronger to quiet me down." Where the road drops away from among the same houses, Mr. Mercer paused for a moment over the view, over the estuary, over the river widening and giving itself up into the endless sea. A sunny light was on that place where sweet and salt meet, and the salt takes all the river in, all the streams of all the hills all along the way, and feels not a bit of difference, but continues vast and flat and through, undrinkable. Kitted up to leave with money and some biscuits for the journey, Mr. Mercer brought his mind to bear on a 6-week baby, beginning in a girl of 20, in the ice, now after 60 years uncovered, because the glacier had lost its snow, and discovered in there, fresh. The kindly woman whose house he was standing outside must have watched him for a good 10 minutes from her front window before she came out, worried, and tried her best then, shaking him gently, speaking close up into his absent face, to get through to what was still alive in him, in there behind his glasses and the glaze of tears.